Everyone. Thanks for joining us for this quarterly webinar from Content Operations. With us, we have special guests today from the Community Zone Management Group. We'll be talking on the topic of CZ metadata, contribution, and best practices. We have with us four presenters, Galen Jones, Steve Shadle, Elizabeth York, and Stacy Trail. And with that, I'll hand it over to Galen. If you have any questions throughout the session, please submit them to the Q&A section. We'll be answering throughout the presentation, and if we have time at the end of the session, we'll be answering some questions out loud as well. So, Galen, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rael, for inviting the CZMG to present. We're very glad to be here. If we could move to the next slide, please. I'll provide a quick overview of our agenda today. I'll provide a background of the Community Zone Management Group and what we do, so the scope of the group and what our responsibilities are. But we'll give Steve will give an overview of the Community Zone itself before we move on then to Elizabeth, who will be discussing the contribution and editing of records in the Community Zone. So what to pay attention to, when and why, some tips and tricks which you might want to consider, the use of local extensions, and collection level versus title level contribution. We'll then finish that off with reporting issues to Ex Libris and the best processes to follow there. Finally, Stacey will present to you the survey results from 2021, which we disseminated via Alma List. And finally, we'll have a brief slide listing some of the helpful resources and documentations we'd like to recommend. Okay. We can move to the next slide. I'll start us off with the overview of the group. So it was established back in 2015 as a subgroup of the Alma Product Working Group. I think it was initially chaired by Steve, and then subsequently it was chaired by Eve Cartus of the University of New England before I commenced in the role in 2020. It's a liaison and advisory group, which consists of Ex Libris staff and library customers. We currently have 13 community members and 3 Ex Libris members attend regularly, with other Ex Libris staff attending on an ad hoc basis. We have liaison members representing the CZMG on the Alma Product Working Group. So Stacey is the liaison member for that group, and myself am the liaison member for the Content Working Group. We aim to have representation also on the Authorities Working Group and the Linked Data Interest Group, but we aren't currently at that stage. So looking at the next slide, this is the 2022 membership. So I won't list everyone there. We have a broad representation from New Zealand, Norway, UK, and Canada, and very good representation from North America. Okay. So if we move to the next slide, I'll cover the scope of the Community Zone Management Group. So our charge consists of the reviewing, updating, and advising of Ex Libris on policies and procedures relating to Community Zone bibliographic metadata maintenance. Secondly, to advise on the Community Zone training needs and the development and delivery of educational resources encompassing existing and evolving functionality. We advocate for adherence to international metadata standards by content providers industry bodies and the community, and seek to address misunderstandings or disagreements regarding detrimental editing or the addition of incorrect metadata into the community zone by member institutions. In our next slide is a continuation of the scope, which is to engage with the library community via discussion lists and conferences, to communicate the work that we've completed, and to consult on proposed community zone projects. This webinar being the beginning really of our community outreach. So yeah, we're glad to be making some inroads into this area of our charge. Next, we have the advising of Ex Libris and other community groups on matters concerning bibliographic records and functionality in both the community zone and beyond, and to initiate a system to suggest specific improvements and adjustments to Ex Libris on a formal, regular basis, and work closely with Ex Libris on planning improvements and changes to the community zone. So we meet twice a month in order to do this. Firstly, we have a institution members meeting, and secondly, we have an all members with Ex Libris staff present. And yeah, it's a really great opportunity to help the community make the most of what is a really important resource to many libraries. Thank you. So I'll now pass you on to Steve. Oh no, finally, sorry, our newly developed web page. So you'll see further details of our charge and membership on here. And we hope to also communicate with the community more broadly via this page. Thank you.
Okay, if we can go to the next slide, thank you. So I'm going to provide a very brief overview of the contributions to the community zone, what the sources are for records. For serial records, there are two primary feeds that are used by Ex Libris. The first one is the CONSER file. CONSER is an organization, a cooperative cataloging organization of about 50 mostly North American, mostly academic libraries. There are 150,000 CONSER records in the community zone. They're going to skew mostly towards North American academic collections, so a lot of academic materials. You're not going to find a lot of like magazines, those kind of periodicals, those kind of materials. The other primary source for serial records is the German Union Catalog of Serials, or coming from the German National Library. There's approximately 100,000 of those in the community zone. So altogether about 250,000 records from those two sources. The other source for just in general for non-serial content in terms of fuller level records is our publishers and content providers. There are approximately 55, according to the Content Corner, according to the Ex Libris documentation, there's about 55 of those publishers or content providers that contribute metadata. Most of them contribute through KBART, and then there are a small number who contribute full level records through MARC, but most of them are through contribution of KBART files. So those records will tend to be briefer because KBART is not as developed of a standard as the MARC record. All of that work is coordinated with publishers. So if there's edits that need to happen to any of those records, they need to basically, you'll need to submit a Salesforce case, and then Ex Libris will work with the publisher or content provider on those. And then one of the other sources for fuller level records is ALMA customers. There's basically two paths that ALMA customers can take in terms of contributing records. One is they can contribute collections. There are a number of libraries who will contribute collections, either collections that they somehow have custodial responsibility for, such as the campus digital library that they are responsible for, or they may identify particular collections that they have digitized that they contribute. And then any ALMA customer can contribute to one of 5 free and miscellaneous e-collections. Altogether, in those e-collections at this point, there's about 67,000 records, so it's not an insignificant contribution made by those records. I wanted to go ahead and mention, since Leslie's bringing it up here, in the Q&A about the Conser record, the print version Conser records. We understand that for several years now, there's been confusion. The fact that Ex Libris initially had kept the print version identifiers in the Conser record when they loaded the Conser record to the CZ has caused confusion for customers, and we understand that. And I think, okay, so someone else, again, can correct me. I have lost track whether in the current Conser feed, if those print version ID numbers are getting, the OCLC numbers are getting stripped out or not. To be honest, I really don't remember. But that was a historic, okay, so Ryle answered. And those OCLC numbers for the print version records are getting cleaned up, so you won't see those anymore with newly added records. Thank you, Ryle. So, and then one final point that I'd like to make as preparation for Elizabeth's section is I was reminded in our last meeting that when we're talking about collections of records, bibliographic records are not actually grouped, are not contributed and grouped into collections. Portfolios are in collections. Bib records are standalone that are related into collections through the portfolio records, through the portfolios. Okay, so I just want to be clear on that. When we're talking about in some respects, there really is no such thing as a collection of bibliographic records. Those are just created through the portfolio records. So that's all I have in terms of the overview. So if we could go ahead and pass it along to Elizabeth, that'd be great.
Thanks, Steve, for that overview. So now we're going to move on to some tips to remember when editing CZ records. So our first thing to note is that you can identify CZ bib records because they display a people icon. In this image on this slide, you can see there's a blue people icon next to the first result, and that shows it is a CZ record. And it's important to be able to identify when you're editing a CZ record versus when you're editing a local record, because if you are editing a CZ record, even if it is in your IZ, you are editing the CZ record itself, and your edits will be inherited by all libraries using the CZ record. So it's important to make sure that edits you make to CZ records are correct and beneficial for the entire ALMA community, including libraries that have access to the resource on a different platform. This can be a point of confusion, but even if a CZ record is in your IZ, the edits you make to it are inherited by all ALMA libraries. So make sure to make changes that will be good for everyone. Next slide, please. And so now I'd like to talk about some of the CZ metadata changes you can make yourself. You can edit most of the metadata fields in CZ records, and there are just a few exceptions. Some fields cannot be added to CZ records because they are used for institution or platform specific information. For example, 856 fields and many 9XX fields. Also, the 022 field for ISSN cannot be added or edited to CZ records because it is so important for linking. If an incorrect 022 field was added or a correct one was removed, it would disrupt link resolver linking for everyone using ALMA. So it's important to request edits to 022 fields from Ex Libris instead. You simply can't edit the fields in ALMA yourself. Now, with that being said, you can make all sorts of other field edits to CZ records. So be sure to make changes useful for all ALMA users, regardless of institution or provider. So some examples of good edits to make yourself include adding or correcting subtitles, author, editor, and other contributor information, publication information, such as location, publisher, and year, edition information, tables of contents, standard subject headings, correct identifiers, such as ISBNs, ISBD punctuation, and subfield indicators. And these are just some examples. There are other good fields you can add to, but these are some good fields that, if they're correct for the record, will benefit everyone. Next slide, please. There also are some CZ metadata changes you should not make. And you have to keep in mind when you edit a CZ record, you're editing it for everyone in the CZ. So first, changing a CZ record for one work into a different work is not good because you just changed that title for everybody else using the CZ record. So you're going to disrupt everybody else's catalogs. Along those same lines, you don't want to change a CZ record for one edition into a different edition because all the other libraries were using it to represent the original edition. And by changing it, you've disrupted all their catalogs too. You also don't want to remove valid identifiers such as ISBNs or console numbers or other good values, as they may be used either for link resolver linking or just as match points or as ways people check to see what record is this, what should I know about this? So don't remove good identifiers as other people may be using them. Also, you don't want to add platform or institution specific information. For example, you don't want to add a note saying access restricted to users of your own library because that note will appear for everybody. So make sure to keep the CZ records platform and institution agnostic. Next slide, please. So there also are some CZ metadata changes you should request from Ex Libris by filing a support ticket. And here are some examples of common cases where filing a support ticket is the best way to proceed. First, 022 ISSN additions and corrections. If you notice a CZ record is missing an ISSN and you know that valid ISSN, or if a CZ record ISSN is incorrect, you should report it to Ex Libris so they can look into it and make the correction if necessary. Also, if you see duplicate CZ records for the exact same ebook, same publisher, same edition, same everything, and there are just two of them in the CZ, you can request that Ex Libris merge them. This sometimes happens if different publishers provided different identifiers in their KBART files. You also can report to Ex Libris the needed correction of a CZ record that mixes metadata for different resources. This shouldn't happen, but it occasionally will if one publisher provides the wrong identifier for a resource and then its metadata gets mixed up with another resource's metadata. So Ex Libris can sort this out by separating the metadata onto separate records and moving the portfolios to as needed. Also, you should report to Ex Libris the correction of a metadata error occurring across many records that will require a batch action to correct. For example, if you notice 1,000 records by a certain publisher have an erroneous field, it's much better to report that to Ex Libris so they can perform a batch action rather than you trying to edit each of those 1,000 records yourself. Next slide, please. So thus far, we've been very clear on the point that when you edit a CZ record, you edit it for everyone. So you shouldn't make changes that will only be correct for your own institution. You should make changes that be good for everybody. So what do you do when you need to record institution-specific information about your CZ resources? Next slide, please. You can use local extensions for institution-specific information. And local extensions are fields you add to a CZ record that are only visible to users at your institution. So some example use cases are a database offers multiple modules and you want to list just the ones your institution purchased. Or you would like to add local subject headings, or you would like to add a local call number, or you would like to add a note explaining how this resource is especially relevant to your community. Next slide, please. Which fields can be added as local extensions? Well, these are shown in the Knowledge Center documentation, which we'll also link in the slide at the end of this presentation. They're available in the different MARC formats, and the fields tend to be fields used for linking or for local information, 9x and 9xx. Next slide, please. And how do you add local extensions? It's actually pretty easy. You just open your CZ record in the metadata editor, and in the editing actions menu, select add local extension. I've circled it in green in the picture on this slide, and the new field will appear with an institution icon next to it. It looks like a little building with columns, and you can add your field and save and release the record, and you've got your local extension. You could also use normalization processes to maintain local extensions, and you can add local extensions in the repository, update inventory, and new order import profiles. Next slide, please. We're going to look at a local extension in my IZ view. So this is my own institution, and we purchased several modules on the Audio Digest platform for different medical specialties. Other libraries may have purchased different modules. We want to add local extensions to show our users exactly which modules our library purchased. So we activated the Audio Digest database collection from the ALMA CZ, and in the CZ MARC record, we added 590 fields as local extensions listing the modules we purchased. And the local extension fields are then published to our institution's Primo so our users see them. And when viewing the record in our IZ, as we see in the image on this slide, the institution icons show which fields are the local extensions. So you can see in this image, the little buildings with columns show which fields are the local extensions. Next slide. If I switch over to the CZ view for the exact same record, we do not see our local extensions, and that's good because other ALMA libraries using this CZ record do not see our local extensions either. Our local extensions are only visible in our IZ and in our Primo. So if you have institution-specific information you want to record in a bibliographic record for a CZ resource, you can use local extensions. Next slide, please. I'd also like to mention that you can use electronic collection and portfolio fields to record institution and platform-specific information for resources. Sometimes information is specific to your institution and to a specific platform or provider, and it is thus best stored in the electronic collection or portfolio. Some examples of this type of information include number of simultaneous users and special authentication instructions, like telling a user they have to create a personal account to access the resource. And this is the kind of information that actually can be best stored in a portfolio note field, because you may have an ebook record in your ALMA, but you may have portfolios for many different platforms attached to that same record, and only one of those portfolios has a simultaneous user limit or requires special authentication procedure. So that's the kind of information that's best stored just in that portfolio and not in the bibliographic record. Because if you put it in the bibliographic record, it would look like it applied to all the portfolios. So just think about how you can use the architecture of ALMA to store your information in the best possible place. Next slide, please. So we've talked about editing CZ records and adding our institution-specific information using local extensions or portfolio and collection fields. But how can we contribute content that is portfolios and collections to the ALMA CZ? And Steve already touched on this a little, but I'm going to talk about it in a little more detail. Next slide, please. So we have to start by acknowledging most CZ content is managed by Ex Libris. Most CZ electronic collections are created and maintained by Ex Libris from provider-supplied title lists, typically KBART files. And when Ex Libris loads the KBART file into ALMA, its rows match to CZ records, typically on identifier, ISBN, or ISSN, or if there is none of those titles. And then the KBART file creates portfolios attached to the matching CZ records. Ex Libris loads updates from providers on a regular basis, typically monthly. And because this collection is managed by Ex Libris, to request a change to one of these collections, you can contact Ex Libris and the provider to supplying your Ex Libris ticket number. So that's how the vast majority of ALMA collections work. Next slide. But Ex Libris does offer ways that ALMA community members can contribute electronic portfolios and collections to the ALMA CZ. And there are two different ways to do this. And first, you can contribute, update, or delete any portfolio in the 5 community managed electronic collections in the ALMA CZ. And these are free e-journals, miscellaneous e-journals that are not free, miscellaneous free e-books, miscellaneous e-books that are not free, and US government documents. And unlike most ALMA collections, these collections aren't based on a provider's title list. They contain resources from a whole mix of providers. Also, you can contribute an entire electronic collection to the ALMA CZ, and this is called a community contributed electronic collection. Next slide, please. It's important to differentiate between community managed and community contributed collections. The 5 community managed collections are managed portfolio by the ALMA community. And ALMA users may contribute, update, and request deletion of any portfolio in these collections, including those contributed by other libraries. Whereas a community contributed collection is managed just by the ALMA library that contributed it. And only the library that contributed the collection can add, update, and delete the collection's portfolios. The use case for this is a library wants to share its own institutional digital collection or another collection it has custody of. And historically, there's been some confusion over how these types of collections differ, what kind of changes you can make to each, but Ex Libris support has recently been retrained and Knowledge Center documentation updates are pending. So there's going to be much clearer information available in the future. And in August 2022, Ex Libris is introducing a new CZ field that will show each CZ collections type. You'll be able to see whether collection is managed by Ex Libris, whether it's community managed or community contributed, and this will make it easier to tell which collection is which. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about community managed and community contributed collections, I'd like to talk briefly about contributing, updating, and deleting portfolios from community managed collections. And any ALMA user with portfolio editing permissions may, within ALMA, without filing a support ticket, contribute new portfolios to the community managed collections. And if there's no MARC record for the resource you're contributing, your local MARC record is contributed to the CZ2. Also, you can update existing portfolios, including those contributed by other libraries. ALMA libraries users may request deletion of portfolios in these collections by filing a support ticket. And beginning with the August 22 release, though, we'll be able to delete portfolios within ALMA without filing a support ticket. So these are the 5 community managed electronic collections, and we really have a lot of power over these because we can add, update, and delete portfolios from them. So before making changes, check the collection scope and make sure the changes you make will be beneficial for all libraries. If you're adding a free portfolio, make sure it's free for everyone. If you're updating coverage dates, make sure they're correct for everybody. If you're updating URL, make sure it's a good solid URL that'll work for everyone. If you request a portfolio deletion, make sure it's truly gone from the internet and nobody can access it. And I don't have time to talk through the detailed steps of how you contribute a portfolio or update a portfolio within ALMA. So I'm going to refer you to the Knowledge Center documentation for more detailed steps. And next slide. I'm going to highlight the key step to contributing and updating portfolios, and that is the Contribute row action in the Portfolios tab of the Service Editor. So in this slide, you can see I've circled in green the Contribute row action for a title. And for these 5 community managed collections, when you go into the Services Editor and the Portfolios tab, you can find a title on the list. And if it's a local portfolio and you select Contribute, it's going to turn into a CZ portfolio. You've just contributed it to the CZ. If it's a CZ portfolio and you've put in a local override for the URL or coverage dates, when you click Contribute, you're going to push your local URL or your local coverage dates to the CZ, so they become the global URL or global coverage dates. So check the documentation for more details, but just remember this Contribute action is your key to contributing new portfolios to the 5 community managed collections or updating existing ones. Next slide, please. I'd also like this opportunity to dispel a myth about community managed collections. And that myth is if you contribute a portfolio, you're the only user who can update it. And if another ALMA library notices an update should be made, they have to contact you to request the update. I've promulgated this, I've heard this from support, I've heard this from other ALMA users, but it turns out this isn't actually true. Any ALMA user with portfolio editing permissions can update any contributed portfolio within the ALMA interface. Ex Libris support will not update a contributed portfolio, but ALMA users can. So don't hesitate to contribute portfolios to the community managed collections, and don't hesitate to update them either, because everyone can add and update the portfolios. You're not responsible for updating your own portfolios. Everybody can update them. Next slide, please. So we've talked about contributing and updating portfolios in the community managed collections. Now we're going to talk about community contributed collections. And these are useful for cases where you have unique free local content you'd like to share and you want to contribute the whole collection to the CZ. You'll start by organizing your local portfolios into a local electronic collection. And then in the electronic collection editor, you use the Contribute to Community button to contribute your collection to the CZ. Your collection will be added to the CZ with status in review, and Ex Libris will check the collection linking and verify your collection isn't in the CZ already. After you contribute the collection, the Contribute to Community button becomes an Update in Community button. And after you make your local changes, you can use this button to push the changes to the CZ. Now, with community contributed collections, the assumption is you created the collection, you understand it, you know its links, you know its resources, so your institution will be responsible for updating the collection. Other libraries will not be able to add, update, or delete portfolios. And you can see the Knowledge Center documentation for more detailed steps. Next slide, please. I just like to highlight the key step, which is the Contribute to Community button in the electronic collection editor. So when you have a local electronic collection, if you go into the electronic collection editor, you'll see this Contribute to Community button, which I've circled in green on this slide. And clicking that button will push your local electronic collection to the CZ and kick off the process of turning it into a community contributed collection. So thank you, everyone. I'd like to hand this over to Stacy now for her segment of the presentation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So what I'm going to talk about now is the survey that we did in the summer of 2021, and I'm sure that many of you may have answered this survey. The Community Zone Management Group distributed a survey last summer through the ALMA list. We had a couple of reasons for doing the survey, some of which you have heard addressed over the course of this presentation. First, we wanted to get a better sense for how and when ALMA users edit community zone bibliographic records. Second, we wanted to understand whether and why ALMA users added or changed identifier fields in particular, specifically marked 020, 035, and 776. The survey results inform our ongoing work with Ex Libris to determine whether editing any of these fields should be restricted, as mark 022 is restricted, and also something that we know is of keen interest to the community, how we can move forward with the cleanup of inaccurate identifiers. Our work on all of these topics is ongoing, but we thought it would be of interest to all of you if we shared the survey results through this presentation. The first question we asked was simply whether ALMA users ever make changes to CZ bib records. Out of our 141 respondents, about 60% do occasionally edit CZ bibs, while just about 40% do not. 141 responses is, we thought, a very healthy number, but also I would also just mention that at this point there are, I don't even know how many ALMA community users, institutions, perhaps close to 2,000, maybe more. So it's still a relatively small slice of the entire ALMA user community. Nevertheless, this was a little bit surprising that, to me, that only 60% make changes to CZ bib records. For those who do change CZ bib records, there were a series of questions about the nature of the changes that they make. So the first question we asked there was, for what purposes do you edit or change CZ records? And the the graphic here is just cut off a little bit because there were a lot of free text answers that are summarized in the bullet points below. The vast majority, almost 93%, who answered this question do so to correct metadata errors. About 29% will edit CZ records to remove duplicate fields. About 28% will do it to make changes that will improve link resolver functionality. 12% will edit CZ records to remove metadata that isn't relevant to their institution. And as you can imagine, that's a little bit, there's a little bit of interpretation there because we are not always certain what people mean by the metadata that they believe isn't relevant to their institution. It could legitimately be fields in CZ bib records that were added by other institutions that were institution specific and that should have been added through the process of local extensions, as Elizabeth demonstrated. Or it could be other legitimately applicable, broadly applicable metadata elements. We don't know there, and so there might be some future work to figure out what exactly people mean when they talk about metadata that isn't relevant to their institution. Other reasons that respondents gave for editing or changing community zone records included adding alternate and former titles, dates of publication, ISBNs, open access designations in a MARC 506 field, Library of Congress subject headings, and medical subject headings. We asked next if users ever added any of the following fields, including 020, 035, and 776. Many respondents indicated that they add these fields when identifiers are missing without providing specific situations when they would do so. But several respondents did offer explanations for when they would add those fields, including they might add a 020 and or a 776 field, excuse me, to match CDI article metadata in order to fix link resolver failures. They might add a 020 when 13-digit ISBNs are not present in the record, only 10-digit ISBNs. They might add a 776 for print version ISBNs. They might add 020 and or 776 to improve deduplication and or fervorization in Primo. And they might add a 776 subfield W for a print version OCLC number, while at the same time removing those from 035 subfield A. We next asked if users ever delete any of the following fields, again, 020, 035, and 776. Most respondents indicated that they only delete these fields if the identifiers in those fields are verifiably incorrect. And this was very good news and what we were hoping to learn. Circumstances in which respondents would delete these fields include 035 fields with OCLC numbers that are for print version records, 020 or 776 if the identifiers in those fields are causing inaccurate link resolution from CDI records. And 776 fields might be removed if the institution can determine that that field was contributing to inaccurate Primo fervorization or deduplication. And that gets a little tricky because not every, for Primo VE, I believe every institution's fervorization and dedupe settings are likely to be the same if they're using those. But for Primo back office, institutions may have customized fervor and dedupe. So it's not always clear that making a change like this is going to fix a problem for everybody. The next question we asked was whether institutions ever change the content of 020, 035, or 776 when they are already present in a record. And as above, respondents indicated that they generally change those fields when the identifiers were verifiably incorrect, which is good news. Other reasons for editing include distinguishing print version and electronic version identifiers and to fix link resolver failures. Again, there's a bit of a pattern here that you may notice. And in general, we believe these are all legitimate reasons to edit the identifiers in these fields. The next question asked whether institutions report problems with community zone records to Ex Libris via Salesforce cases. And this question was asked of everybody, regardless of whether or not they answered earlier that they edit CZ records themselves. So there were 141 total responses to this question. About 62%, just under 62%, indicated that they do report problems with community zone records. And that's good news. but 38.3% indicated that they don't. And that's not as encouraging. I think we would all probably like to see that number a little higher, although we recognize that creating a Salesforce case is an added burden on the individual and the individual's workload, and it may not always be feasible for people to go in and create a Salesforce case. However, here are some of the reasons that folks gave for reporting problems with CZ records to Ex Libris. Duplicate records, that's a big one. Elizabeth talked about this, and that's a great reason to open a Salesforce case. Incorrect or missing ISSNs in 022 fields, again, a very common reason to open a case and a really good reason to do so. Other problems that people found in unprotected fields when they preferred not to edit the record themselves. Print version records that were being used to represent electronic versions was also a reason that some respondents gave for opening Salesforce cases about CZ-BIB records. Some institutions open cases to report Conser records that have not been updated in the community zone. And this has been an ongoing source of frustration, especially for Conser libraries who know when they are creating or enriching Conser records and then they don't see those changes ever appear in the community zone. And that is a topic that the CZ management group has continued to work on with Ex Libris. Other folks have reported serial title changes or closed titles, another good reason to open a case. And finally, if the language of cataloging for a particular bibliographic record was changed from English to another language. One of the stickiest questions that we asked, and one of the ones where we were really not sure what kind of responses we might get, was whether institutions use the OCLC numbers that are in 035 fields of some community zone records. And as you all are probably well aware, not every community zone record has an OCLC number, nor are they likely to. But when those 035s with OCLC numbers are present, we wanted to know if any institutions were using those for workflows or processes. Just over half, about 54%, said no, that they do not use those. It's actually a little more than that because there were free text responses here that also amounted to no. But there were about 35% who said that yes, they do use those OCLC numbers for something. This was a bit of a surprise to me personally, knowing some of the issues, especially with print version OCLC numbers existing erroneously in community zone records, which Steve addressed a little bit earlier. So it turns out that in a lot of cases, the OCLC numbers that are in community zone records are used for manual processes. So of the folks who gave us a reason for why they use these OCLC numbers, a lot of them use them as a secondary element for manual matching and enrichment. Some use them to identify duplicates in their own collections. Some have used community zone OCLC numbers for OCLC data sync to set OCLC holdings. My editorial comment there is that's a little terrifying to me, knowing the issues with OCLC numbers in community zone records. Some institutions noted that they don't find those OCLC numbers reliable enough to serve as a sole match point, which matches the experience of most of us in the community zone management group. Many express frustration at the prevalence of print version OCLC numbers in CZ records. We've known this is a problem for a long time. The survey results confirmed that. So there's a lot of frustration here. This is clearly a major pain point. And this is something where unfortunately, there also aren't very easy answers here. In general, the survey results show that ALMA users work hard to be good stewards of community zone records, but they also experience many frustrations with inaccurate or missing identifiers. And many don't fix or report problems with CZ records when they are found. We also learned that there isn't always a single solution that would satisfy the needs and current workflows of all ALMA users, meaning that any changes or cleanup will have to be very carefully thought through and then communicated with the community. CZMG is continuing to work with Ex Libris to improve the accuracy of identifiers and other metadata in CZ records and to help community members understand the impact of their changes to CZ-BIB records. So thanks to all of you for attending this webinar today. and along with alternatives for managing any institution-specific data that you might wish to reflect in community zone records. So with that, that is the end of our presentation, and we have one more slide here, which, as Galen mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is a list of useful links that you may want to refer to later, documentation that you may wish to review. The documentation covers community zone serial record enrichments and how those occur, using local extensions, which Elizabeth demonstrated, contributing community zone portfolios, and contributing community zone local electronic collections, both of which Elizabeth also walked through. And so with that, I will thank all of you very much for attending. And it looks like we have about 15 minutes remaining for questions. So if you have more questions, please add them to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for presenting. It's really very interesting. We did get one question in the chat that just couldn't be responded to in writing. It was about why the CZ monograph records usually have only the 10-digit ISBNs in the field 020 instead of the 13-digit ISBNs. And if it's okay, I'll also respond to that question. The display is of the 10-digit ISBN if that's what we received from the provider, but behind the scenes we actually also index the 13-digit ISBN. So in terms of when you do a search and you perform a search, you can also search for the 13-digit ISBN, and those results will come up as well. It's really just a display issue of whatever the provider happened to have supplied first. Those tend to be the historical 10-digit values rather than the 13-digit ones, but the newer records definitely have the 13-digit ones in them. So we do have a question here, and I see there was a little bit of a follow-up about what would be the best practice when we think data in a concert record should be changed. An example, changing the 00821 character from W to N. I've seen this character changed to N by an ALMA institution and then changed back to W by the system. Do any of our panelists want to? I mean, from an ex-libris perspective.
So I was just wondering if Steve would be able to take that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the New York Times has a very long and sordid history having to do with the fact that when it was originally, when the online version was first made available, the New York Times website, the journal website or the newspaper website called it the New York Times on the Web. So that was the key title that was assigned, and that was the 245. There is a larger issue here that has nothing to do with directly with the concert record or the community zone record, which is people are identifying two different works for the New York Times, one being the content that is available on the website on like a newspaper homepage or a newspaper website, and the other being all of the digitized back issues of the New York Times. Unfortunately, because of the current provider neutral practice within Concert, and this is still, and there's a disagreement among Concert participants as well on this, just so that we're clear. But the provider neutral practice, many people would say both of those versions should be on one record, that they are both electronic versions of the same work, electronic manifestations of the same work. So that's the issue that we're wrestling with now, is the fact that we have one CZ record that is describing both the website and the digitized newspapers. Okay, so, and until that gets resolved, just in terms of concert records, you're just going to see one concert record there. So I'm not sure what the best solution is for that. you know, we as a community can talk about it. It's going to be a while before that's actually resolved in concert. And it's not just an issue for the New York Times. It's an issue for any newspaper that has a newspaper website that is putting out content, updating content as an integrating resource, as a website, but at the same time, the original print version, digitized, is also available separately. Okay, so we actually had talked on the CZMG at one time, we had talked about locking down the New York Times record, only because the edit wars were really getting out of hand. And we decided not to, but that might be an option again in the future if the edit wars get out of hand again. So, yeah, let me know if you have any further questions about that, but that's what the background is specifically on the New York Times.
We have another question about the percentage of CZ records that are overwritten in the monthly updates by Ex Libris. Off the top of my head, I cannot give a percentage. This is a known functionality. Some might consider it a known issue. Some might consider it, you know, how the system works. It is true that edits that are performed by specific institutions can be overwritten by updates supplied by the content provider. Generally speaking, on a large scale, those are updates that are positive updates that are their intention is to be as current as the metadata that the provider supplies. If there are bigger issues that come in and you see we need to go back to the provider and tell them you have to make these edits in your source records, then that's also important information for us to have so that we can convey that to the content providers. And I think that's one of the areas where we definitely see a lot of feedback about that. And we understand and appreciate that it's not a simple structure, right? Because this is a shared mechanism. This is an area where we are, our goal is to have as many contributors as possible. It does mean that there's potential for overwriting, and in the case of the New York Times, we call it editing wars, but in the case of, you know, a provider update, it can just be a frustrating endeavor that you've worked so hard on updating a record and then it gets overridden and you're not sure why. So if that does happen and you see something happening with specific providers, please let us know so we can talk to the providers. But aside from that, we do publish the providers that we work with who send us MARC metadata, and those records are much more likely to be overridden over time with updates from the providers. So that's just a general tip out there as well. We have another question here. Could the links in the list of, oh, okay, sure. So Stacy, thank you.
I was just going to say, I did put the links from the list of useful resources into the chat so that you can follow them and they're active links for you. So thanks for prompting that.
I don't see any other open questions at this time. If you do think of other questions and you want to contact us, Stacy, maybe we can drop in the working group's email address if there are questions you want to address to the CZ management group directly. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you have a rest of a lovely day today and the rest of the week. And thank you to the CZ management group for attending and participating and creating this wonderful presentation. It was really very, very helpful and informative. So thank you very much.
I will just say quickly, we do not at the moment have an email address for the Community Zone Management Group. However, if you will post to the ALMA list and call out specifically the Community Zone Management Group, we will address through that channel.
Thank you.